Okay, so this is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing our reading of Imagination and Invention. We're on part 3 of the book, and we're still in section A of that part, I believe. Uh, yes. Oh no, sorry. We started section B of that part. So we're on page 108 um, uh, of the translation. So last time. Forget where exactly we started last time, but we looked at so the psychical level, the second level of Simondon's cycle of the image, in the in the third phase of the cycle. So we're dealing with images after the encounter with the object, and now we're looking at the psychical level of this cycle. And so he starts with what is maybe a borderline phenomenon. So it's not clear whether this counts as a sort of psychical level phenomenon, but it's what he calls consecutive effects. So this is like the sort of simplest example. This is just after images that you see after looking at a bright light. So I think I mentioned this example last time. Like if you're lying in bed at night and you pick up your phone, you look at your phone for a minute and then you turn it off. You have this after image of this sort of rectangular bright spot that sort of floats in front of your eyes. And if you pay attention to that rectangular after image, you'll see it actually changes color every second or so. And you can even like track the sequence of colors, which should be a certain sequence. It's not just random colors, but like you have a sequence of colors that you'll see depending on what color the light was you were looking at. So there were, I think, early 20th century, there were studies of like these different structures of after images, like what colors you see depending on what color you were looking at, and how quickly they change and things like that. And you can potentially have after images or something like an after image in other sense modalities as well. So Simondon mentions like after, if you hear a sudden, very loud sound, an explosion or something like that, or even if you go to a concert where the music is loud, and then afterwards you have this ringing sensation in your ears. And so, of course, this is much less structured and detailed than our visual after images, but you still have this sort of auditory sensation that continues after the initial encounter with the object. But then I think what Simondon is more interested in, what he wants to contrast with these consecutive images, is a more clearly psychological process, which is memory images, when he talks about immediate images and eidetic images. One example of these immediate images is the example that he cites from another author, where this person is sort of sitting at his desk and he hears a bell ringing in the distance, and he's not really paying attention. And then he notices after a few seconds that the bell seems to be ringing over and over again. Like he seems to hear an extremely long sequence of bell ringing. And he thinks this doesn't make sense. The bell wouldn't ring 1,000 times or 20 times or whatever. And then he sort of goes back to his memory and pays more attention, and he realizes that he was actually imagining some of the like later pulls of the bell. And so in this case, because you have a very faint sound with very low localizability, it's just sort of vaguely in the distance. He was sort of it was sort of at the borderline between actually hearing it and just imagining it. So he was like sort of able to confuse the imagined bell sound with the actual very faint bell sound. So here we have like an image, production of an image, this imaginary bell sound that is sort of on the borderline, or is very close to the borderline of actual sensation. So this is like one kind of image. This is the immediate image. But then maybe a more interesting case is the these eidetic images that he talks about, and like the sort of example that we talked about a bit last time is chess players, who are many, or there are many chess players who are capable of playing blindfolded. So there are and he cites Simondon cites Pt.1, who had talked to some of these chess players and described how they did this operation. And the one he cites here, this chess player, he would look at the pieces and get a very clear mental image of the pieces first, before the blindfold goes on. And then after he's blindfolded, he would visualize the movement of each of these pieces, the actual pieces with their color and shape and everything. And he had a very clear mental image of where all the pieces are. And if he ever sort of feels confused and he's not 100% sure, if he is remembering correctly where the pieces are, he would sort of replay their movements over the course of the match so far, visualizing again where each piece is. So again, these chess players have this very structured, very detailed mental image that they can manipulate in their minds. They can see what would happen if I moved this piece here, and how would my opponent respond, and so on. Of course, most of us don't have this very detailed visual imaginative capacity, but yes, we all of us have at least some capacity of imagining something, producing a mental image of something, and then sort of manipulating that mental image in our minds, to try to figure out, what would happen if I did this, or if I, moved this element of the object in this way, or anything like that. So this is obviously something that these chess players have an extraordinary capacity to do, but all of us have, at least some capacity to do this. And then the next question that Simondon brings up is, is this sort of eidetic memory capacity, this capacity to have these detailed visual images or auditory images and so on, is this like a very sophisticated intellectual skill, or is it something maybe not so sophisticated? Because if you think about it, like a photograph, you can take a picture of the chessboard and then you have a very detailed record of the where all the pieces are, and it's extremely precise and everything. Or you could videotape like from above where all the pieces are over the course of a match. But of course, the camera is not a sophisticated intellectual device. It's completely mechanical, or just basic electronics. It doesn't understand chats. It just records the movement of light. Where it just, the pixels respond to the light arriving on them, and so on. So it could be the case that this memory performance of the chess players is a similarly not like unsophisticated process. They're just sort of recording the events that happen, and then they can replay it in their memory. But what Simondon points to here is other types of eidetic performances that are maybe a little less, or that where the sophistication seems more clear than in maybe the chess playing example. So he talks about Mozart, this story about Mozart who heard a mass performed in the Sistine Chapel twice, and then was able to write down the whole thing from memory. And he did it so faithfully that people thought he had like stolen the score, which it was forbidden to reproduce. Mozart, of course, is an extreme example, but there are other musicians who are capable of hearing a song once and then they can play the whole thing from memory. What Simondon suggests is that this type of sort of memory performance has to do not with just a sort of pure recording function, but a sort of grasp of the structure. The musical structure of a work is sort of grasped. And that's what allows for the reproduction. And so, like Mozart, of course, was not just someone who had this sophisticated memory of music, but also a inventive musician himself. And so there's a sort of continuity between his capacity to grasp the structure of a musical work that he hears and his capacity to produce new works with interesting musical structure. and so so this type of memory performance is indicative of a more sophisticated intellectual capacity, and it's not just sort of a pure recording function. So I think that's where we ended last time. So if someone would like to pick up from page 108 and read, to read up to the section break or subsection break of subsection 3, please.
I can read. The immediate image is distinct from the eidetic image because, very much akin to sensation and perception, it preserves concrete characteristics devoid of signification. In the eidetic image, while characteristics remain concrete, they are already selected in the direction, sens, of their typical and significative function. The absence of shadows or sculptural details in chess pieces, but conservation of the rules for movement, direction, and position. The characteristics preserved by the eidetic image represent so many anchor points between the subject and his environment. These anchor points secure ulterior paths of access to the objects of the milieu for the subject. They also offer elements for a combinatory activity. Indeed, several authors who observed eidetism have noted the plasticity of these images. The starting point is provided by the initial state of a situation perceived effectively. Yet the subject may later act mentally on the eidetic image to impose transformations of it as if he were acting effectively on objects, writing a number in chalk on an imaginary blackboard, modifying the position of the pieces of an imagined chessboard through eidetic vision. When representation becomes uncertain, according to the testimony of chess players studied by 10, the eidetic image may be restored through a recapitulation of the different successive modifications taking place during the game. Woodworth cites the research of Urbanschitz, I can't pronounce that, on eidetic images, as well as those of Jansch, and considers, in opposition to Ten's opinion, that the eidetic image differs notably from perception. It does not resemble a photograph, since its details are not all simultaneously present. It develops progressively. When a question relating to a detail is asked, some amount of time may elapse before the detail is sufficiently clarified to provide an answer. Quote, small details reveal themselves while adjacent parts of the image remain blank. The quantity of details described in no way corresponds to the sum of what might be found in an actual image. Unquote. Kluver, 1930. The plasticity of the eidetic image is such that some subjects can modify it willfully or under the influence of suggestion. Objects may change form or color and move within the image. Finally, among children, we can note that subjects obtain the good images only of scenes of interest to them. Eidetic images register the significant objects of a situation and the significant traits of these particular objects. In this way, they are quite different from photographs or paintings by artists who are interested in the relationship of light and shadow without emphasizing the salient lines of remarkable objects. Woodworth, Psychologie Experimentale. For Woodworth, the eidetic image is a phenomenon of memory rather than of perception. It displays the characteristic of mnesic images, not those of perception. This conclusion is rather close to Benet's study of the memory of chess players, which discovered that it contains the representation of the moves the pieces can make. Quote, the bishop is not a baroquely shaped piece. It is essentially a piece that moves obliquely, unquote. We might say that the eidetic image is already, in a very elementary sense, a symbol, since it outlines perception and stylizes it according to the subject preserving the memory. The fact that the eidetic image deserves to be studied as a mnesic phenomenon removes nothing from the particular character of its acquisition. We might perhaps note, while waiting for further research, the continuity that exists between the phenomena of imprinting, empreinte, and those of eidetism. Intense situations triggering a high degree of vigilance favor the acquisition of an eidetic image, which, by the way, may not concern directly the object generating the emotion or the heightened vigilance. Hence, during a phone conversation bearing important news and necessitating precise and attentive answers, one may acquire through eidetic vision the memory of a visual detail without any logical connection with the content of the communication, and which requires no active visual perception. The image of the threads of a screw on a phone receiver, a detail of a piece of furniture, etc., Most often, eidetic images acquired during an intense situation are linked to the central and significant object around which the situation is organized. But if the situation is abstract and symbolic and concerns only one of the senses, as in a phone conversation, the registered image may not be connected to the central and significant object, which demonstrates that the quote-unquote hot situation generates a state comparable to that of the critical periods favoring imprinting, imprint, for the various forms of perceptual sensorial activity. This shift at the end here to eidetic images that are acquired in these situations of high vigilance is interesting because I understood the eidetic image to be, as he describes it earlier, sort of a manipulable image that has more to do with the I guess deep familiarity or expert knowledge of the subject in which the image is created with the situation. And in both the case of Mozart and the chess player, the chessboard or the score is manipulable, I think, in a sense. But there's this kind of displacement of the symbolic aspect of the traumatic phone call, I guess, and the image that's associated with it in this last example.
Yeah, I think here maybe the difference is, on the one hand, we have a more sort of intellectual use of an eidetic image in the case of the chess player, and even Mozart, like he's able to sort of analyze the piece as he's listening to it. So it's and then in relation to this mental image, they can like manipulate it. They can think, what would happen if I moved this chess piece here, or they can change the color in their imagination and so on. So this is like here the subject is sort of at a remove from the image. They're sort of manipulating the image without any sort of emotional investment in it. But then the other type of eidetic image that Simondon sort of points out at the end of this section is, these images that arise as a result of an emotionally intense experience of some kind. And I think likely this is more often the case with negative experiences. So like this phone call example, we can imagine like you hear the news that a loved one has died or something like that, or you're having an argument over the phone with your partner or something, something very emotionally intense in that sense. And then while you're on the phone, you're sort of staring at, like, I don't know, the grain of the wood on the desk or something like that. And this image, which has nothing to do with the content of the conversation, gets sort of imprinted in your mind. And so he compares this to the imprinting process that we looked at a few weeks ago with birds and some other animals that, in the early hours of their life or minutes even, they sort of attach themselves to a figure that they take to be their parent. And I think maybe the connection we can make between these two types of eidetic image is, by means of what he points out a little bit earlier, namely that the subject only retains that aspect of the situation that is sort of interesting to them. So the chess player, of course, is very interested in chess. They have an intense interest in chess, and chess is something that they are passionate about. So they like focus on the chessboard. But if you ask them, like, what type of clothes is your opponent wearing, after you blindfolded them, they might not be able to answer that question because that's something that they don't care about. So likewise in these intense conversation on the phone, you have this sort of emotional investment in the situation. But here, because it's a sort of abstract symbolic operation as opposed to like, the manipulation of pieces on a board, and also because it's a sort of experience that only affects one sensory modality, it means the other sensory modalities, like vision in this case, are able to sort of freely join or connect with the experience. So these two types of eidetic image are maybe not so different after all, even though they, of course, have their differences. But in each case, it's the subject's sort of investment in the situation, like the particular part of the situation or aspect of the situation that they find interesting is the one that sort of brings about the possibility of an eidetic imprinting. And in the sort of normal case, it will be actually the content of the eidetic image will sort of correspond with the aspects of the situation that they found interesting. But in cases like the phone conversation, it's sort of the experience as a whole that brings about this eidetic imprinting effect, and then it can be like another sense modality that has nothing to do with the actual content of the experience that is remembered. So yeah, it's again this sort of intense interest that brings about the imprinting experience, and then that experience can proceed in different ways depending on the type of situation that's bringing about that experience. Okay, so let's go on to the next subsection. This is a long one, so we'll read about a page or so if I can get a volunteer. So from the beginning of subsection 3. Everyone's shy today. Okay, I can read this next one, but hopefully someone else will volunteer for the one after that. Okay, subsection 3. Memory images, notion of a reproductive imagination, imaginative types, generic images. The memory image is that which may reappear at any time after the end of the perceptual situation to which it is related. The image is then the occasion of a representation or a revival, reviviscence, characterizing the secondary state and differentiating it from the primary state. The latter being extended in rather than represented by the consecutive image and the immediate image. A theoretical question arises. In what ways is the memory image different from the eidetic image? Practically speaking, the nucleus of the eidetic image may function as an active center for a complex memory image. A famous example of Proust's Madeleine may be analyzed within the purview of eidetism, for theoretically nothing prevents such perceptual sensorial imprinting phenomena to extend beyond the visual category. Moreover, other olfactory eidetic images can be found in Proust, such as the smell of gas for automobiles, which forms the nucleus of a multitude of visual and oral imprintings related to travel, the horizon of the road, and visited landscapes. According to Proust's description, revival occurs many years later through the intermediary of the smell in a very different situation than travel. The subject smells gas fumes rising from the street below while he wakes up in a Parisian hotel. We are extending the use of the term quote-unquote eidetic. Originally, it applied only to the visual category. The existence of an active eidetic center within the memory image faces an oft-repeated and now classic argument, that of the impossibility of enumerating the components of the represented object. More specifically, if a person claiming he quote-unquote sees the Pantheon in his imagination is asked to count the columns he quote-unquote sees, such enumeration is generally impossible. On the basis of this incapacity, certain authors have contested the concrete character of memory images, taking the descriptions of such images as sheer nonsense. Yet the demonstration is far from conclusive. Researchers who have studied the various operations of perceptual analysis, particularly Professor Postel in building a reading machine, have recognized the importance of concrete supports, of arresting points that allow the analyzing gaze to secure reference points in the object. It is almost impossible to count the bars of a metal fence or the rows of a brick wall without reference points. When the natural heterogeneities of the object display such features in themselves, a rusty bar, a thinner bar, etc., the perceptual analysis is easy. In a real object seen in a concrete situation, local heterogeneities may be important and progressive, accompanying and guiding perceptual activity. The columns of the Pantheon, when placed in a circle, are all lit in a different way. Moreover, the apparent intervals separating them increase progressively because of perspective from the sides to the center from the viewpoint of the observer. The resistance offered by these reference points, anchors of an analyzing perceptual activity, is no longer present in the image because the image is already abstract and quote-unquote purer than perception. In the mental image of the Pantheon, there are no longer shadows and details of distinct hues that individualize each column, providing an internal structure to the series. By contrast, the enumeration of components in an eidetic image remains possible when these components are differentiated by their signifying functions, as in a written word. Its letters considered as letters are different from each other, not only in perception but in the image. Researchers from the second half of the 19th century noticed individual differences with respect to the vividness and precision of memory images. First, we may wonder whether everyone possesses this capacity of semi-concrete mental representation to the same degree. However, subjective descriptions and analyses require delicate interpretation if one seeks to use them as an absolute basis for the evaluation of the degree of quote-unquote concreteness of images within various subjects. On the other hand, a typology is likely to be less arbitrary when it is a matter of comparing in the same person the degree of vivacity and precision of images relating to various sensorial categories. I'll stop here because the next paragraph is a long one. So again, we're looking at, so now we're looking more at memory images as such. So these eidetic images as a sort of instance of memory images. And the question is, to what extent are these, are memory images in general, including these eidetic images that we looked at in the last section, to what extent are they accurate representations of the worlds? And so this example of the columns of the Pantheon, this is one that Sartre had talked about as well. And I don't know if that's specifically who Simondon was thinking of here, but he gave this same argument, the one that Simondon rejects, namely that if you ask someone to imagine the Pantheon or any similar building that they're familiar with, and then ask them to count the number of columns in their mental image, most of the time they say, I can't, like you can't sort of imagine the image and then count the number of columns in your mental image. And so Sartre takes this to be a sign that the mental image, that there's no such thing as an image as such, there's only imaging consciousness. So it's not that you, as a subject, have a sort of internal object, which is an image sort of floating in front of you. It's instead that you are directing your consciousness towards the Pantheon in this imaging way. And Simondon rejects this argument, and he gives an alternate explanation of why it is that we can't count the number of columns in our mental image. And so he says so when you look at even a real physical object in front of you, not a mental image, but you're looking at a brick wall, for example, and you want to count how many rows there are, it's actually quite difficult to do that without losing track of where you are. As long as the rows are all the same color and the same shape of bricks and everything, it's quite difficult. Or if you think of like a fence and you want to count how many wires there are in the fence, it's a sort of chain link fence or something, you want to count the wires, it's extremely difficult to do that if they're all the same. So what Simondon argues is that when you look at the real Pantheon and you look at the different columns, you have a certain heterogeneity of the columns because the angle of illumination is different. So each column has a slightly different pattern of light and shadow on it, a different hue of the sunlight striking it, and then also the angle of perception. Like you're always looking at it from one direction or another, and so the angle, the visual angle between the different columns is different. So you have this sort of heterogeneity when you're looking at the real image, or the real object, I should say. This heterogeneity makes it possible to count the columns when the object is in front of you, whereas in the mental image you don't have, like when you just picture an object, you don't picture it under any particular illumination, you don't picture it with shadows, you don't picture it from any particular angle. So the mental image is more abstract than the physical object, the perception of the physical object, and it's precisely because of this that you don't have that heterogeneity between the different elements of the image, and that makes it impossible to count them. So this, again, it's an alternate explanation of why we can't count the columns in our mental image. And I think it's an interesting suggestion. I'm not sure whether it's 100% convincing or not, but I think this is an interesting suggestion of and pointing out the difficulty of counting homogeneous real elements like the rows of a brick wall, for example. I think is an interesting contribution as well. Everyone's quiet today. Okay, so if there's no other comments or questions about that bit, we can go on to the next page. So can I get a volunteer to read from the bottom of 111?
I can read. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is this on this differential aspect?
Yes, exactly.
This differential aspect, long noted in literature and arts, was first signaled by Fechner in 1860 and studied by Galton in 1880. Asking subjects to evoke the image of a specific object, Fechner registered various variations of aptitude in the evocation. Galton devised a breakfast table questionnaire. Subjects were invited to evoke the image of their table when they had their breakfast in the morning, noting the degree of definition of objects, the relative brightness of the scene, the character of colors, distinct or natural, etc. The scholars and scientists interrogated by Galton tended to answer they had no mental image. Yet other responses showed that certain objects, one or two for instance among those placed on the table, remained clear in the memory image of several subjects. After having sought to establish an inverse correlation between the vivacity of imagination and intellectual abilities, investigators continuing Galton's research turned towards the study of imaginative types, according to the various aptitudes of each subject, for visual, oral, and other types of imagery. Charcot's studies of aphasia have shown that a given class of images is predominant depending on the various individuals examined. Systematizing his observations, Charcot divided the imaginative types into four: the visual type, the oral type, the motor type, and the mixed type. The visual type recalls a text by representing the page on which it is printed. In the process of learning, these types rely on spatial schematization, using illustrations, colorful reference, and diagrams. Moreover, they tend to convert the data coming from other senses into visual representation, and if they have a poetic bent, they invoke metaphors expressing this conversation. Hugo writes, "The laces of the sound chiseled by the fife." Hugo used engravings and ink drawings, with strongly contrasting shadow and light, to translate his vision of complex scenes and situations with non-visual components. For instance, a storm around a castle nestled on the side of a craggy hill. He stated that abstract ideas evoked for him concrete images. The law gives the image of red-robed judges. Color is the opposition of the green of a plant with the red of a fabric. Form is a round block, a woman's shoulder. Quoted by Cuvillier, after Ribot in Ideas Generales in page 133. Sorry for pronunciation. The visual type may become diversified according to the predominance of the concrete representations of forms, colors, geometrical relationships, or typographical signs. Almost blind, Michelangelo used touch to recognize and admire statues. A painter like Delacroix grants priority in his work to a search for colors, acting not only as elements but as image, because they provide the atmosphere for a scene. See, for instance, his Femme d'Alger painting, drenched in blonde light that showers objects and figures. Another Delacroix is titled Bataille entre un cheval bas et un cheval brun dans une écurie. Une écurie. My French pronunciation again, horrible, sorry. Of course, we take into account the romantic culture of the time. Color is a manifesto against the classicism of the line. Hugo writes, "I placed a red bonnet upon the old dictionary." Yet color has for Delacroix a signifying force that is not present among other painters of his era. Concrete visual geometric memory corresponds to the kind of feats found among chess players. As for the visual typographic type, it is found among people who see mentally each word uttered as if it were printed. Bourdon, in his Intelligence, page 44, cites the case of a student who saw the words he spoke in written or printed form, generally in larger font than those of other people. Renaud in 1912 showed that the properly photographic image of a word is very rare. During his experiments, he never encountered a subject truly capable of reading the letters of a word backward out of a mental image. Generally, subjects asked to do so complain that letters do not stay in place when they try reading backward. Subjects with strong aptitude for evoking visual images succeed in reading backward after finding a process for decomposing a word into several groups of syllables and inverting each syllable separately. By contrast, subjects who do not have solid visual images ultimately rely on a less efficacious process, such as spelling the word from beginning to end repeatedly, eliminating one letter each time. This sequential unidirectional method is comparable to that which could be used on an oral image, but sound sequences are very difficult to reverse by acting on a mental image, since it is only abstractly that the course of time may be reversed. Those rare cases where subjects, generally children, show themselves capable of reading a word backward In eidetic vision, a long and unfamiliar word, for instance, in a foreign tongue, can be seen as illustrations of the properties of the eidetic image as such. Such properties in ordinary mental images are limited, generally, but even for subjects gifted in visual imagery, to the clear view of a reversible group of 2 or 3 letters at the most.
Right. Yeah. So Angus has posted in the chat a couple of the paintings that Simondon mentioned. It sounds like, just from my quick search, it looks like Simondon might be misciting the title of one of them. So the second one, Bataille entre un cheval bai et un cheval bai brun dans une écurie. So in English, that would be a battle between a bay horse and a bay brown horse in a stable. So the idea that Simondon is getting at here is that this painting has this very sort of visually evocative title, but the title that I found was Chevaux arabes battant dans une écurie. So Arab horses fighting in a stable. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe Simondon, maybe this was an alternate title, or maybe Simondon was just misremembering the title, or I'm not sure exactly what has happened in this case. But yeah, so the idea here, there's this typology of mental images that is being discussed here. So the idea is that different people have different sort of types of mental images that predominate in their mental life. So certain people have like a visually oriented mental imagery. So he cites these cases of people who, whenever they think of a concept or a word or whatever, they always have an image of what that concept denotes, or some image associated with that concept. So this sort of typology, I think, might be a little suspect. I know that, for example, this would be connected with the whole idea of learning types. That certain people are visual learners and other people are auditory learners and so on. But my sort of very limited understanding is that theory has been largely debunked. That it doesn't seem to be the case that there are people that are sort of predominantly visual learners versus others who are auditory learners or whatever. But it'd be interesting to sort of do a more systematic study of people's imaginative abilities and the extent to which people are capable of producing visual images versus auditory images, and it does seem plausible that there might be some variation between people in terms of like which kind of image they're able to produce most easily or most effectively. That's sort of the idea here. And then he goes into the first of these types, which is the visual image. So he goes through a few different sort of properties of the visual images. And so one of them is the ability to sort of break down the image into parts. And in particular, in the case of a word, the ability to spell it backwards. So if you have like a very clear visual image of the word, then you should be able to sort of look at the letters and just read them backwards. Because if you are looking at a printed word on a page, or a written word on the page, you can just read it backwards. It's a little bit more difficult than reading it normally, but you can just spell out the letters just looking at them one at a time. But it's actually quite difficult to sort of visualize a word, like have a mental visual image of the word in front of you and then read the letters backwards. According to this one researcher, he says that he was never able to find someone who was capable of doing this task, in an effective way. But yeah, it's what he suggests is that some people actually are able to perform or something like this task, but what they do is they sort of break down the word into pieces. So they sort of read the like first two letters, and then they go on to the next two letters and so on. Again, we're just going through some of the properties of these different types of images and sort of trying to understand what exactly one of these images consists in. That's sort of the task that we're dealing with here.
I guess I find it surprising that the example for the visual memory is this is spelling a word backwards, because that would seem to be more of a, I guess the idea is that you can picture the word spelled out in your memory or in your mind's eye, so to speak, and just read the symbols that appear to you backwards.
Yeah, I think maybe if it's like a real word in a language that you know, it might be easier. But if we picture like just a sequence of letters, like I don't know, 5 random letters in a row, you look at it for 10 seconds, and then the letters disappear off the screen, and the experimenter says, okay, now you need to visualize the letters that you saw and read them backwards. I think that would be a pretty difficult task. So partly, I think the knowledge of the word, like of course, we've seen most English words or the words in a language that we're familiar with. We've seen them thousands of times, so we have this familiarity with the spelling. So we're not purely relying on just the mental image, but our knowledge of the language is sort of filling in the gaps for us. I think maybe this task would be more like it would be sort of the pure visualizing task would be like a sequence of letters that are not a word in the language that we speak. I think that would be the more sort of precise version of this task. Yeah, it's interesting actually that you bring up misplacing your keys, because so before we started recording, we were talking about well, I won't go into it too much, but anyway, we're talking about the predictive processing approach to psychology, and in particular Andy Clark's book, The Experience Machine. And in that book, he gives a little anecdote about how he was sort of about to leave the house, and he picks up his keys, but then he has to go back and get something else, so he puts his keys down. And he comes back and he can't find his keys. He's thinking, I know I just put them down on this table a minute ago, but I can't find them. And then he suddenly remembers that he changed the fob on his keychain from a yellow fob to a pink one or something like that. And then as soon as he remembers that, he's able to see the keys on the table. So I think here, I think this is connected to the types of images that we're talking about here with Simondon, because we in our visual perception, or probably in other forms of perception as well, we have like if you have the task of like finding a certain object, you have to have a mental image of what the object is that you're looking for, and that sort of acts as like a spotlight on anything that sort of resembles that object. So if you're looking through the objects on your table and you're thinking, or the image that you have in your head is this image of a keychain with a yellow fob on it, and you don't see anything yellow, then you're sort of like, you can't see anything that matches your image that you're looking for. But then when you suddenly remember, oh, actually the keychain has a pink fob on it, then suddenly the pink fob stands out. So the visual attention or attention sort of plays a role in perception in a way that maybe would be surprising if you think of perception as sort of a passive process of just taking in information from the world. It's instead a kind of sifting process, I guess, and this applies. So in the case of like purely mental images, like so this sort of makes sense of why we can't manipulate mental images in the same way that we can visual images in front of us. So like it's much harder to read a sequence of letters backwards than it would be to visualize a sequence of letters and then read them backwards in your mind. And so it's partly because our sort of our attention is part of the process of perception, and so like you have to like what you're attending to in an image will modify the image itself, and make certain parts appear and other parts sort of disappear. It's a very complicated process of attention, visualization, comparing your image to what you're seeing, and then sort of figuring out whether they match and so on. There's like still research today into a lot of these aspects of things that Simondon was talking about here.
Kind of an interesting choice to include Hugo in the visual image category, because obviously, you would think he had a pretty strong oral memory, but I think later on he also talks about like mixed types. So maybe that's what he has in mind.
Yeah, I think so. The idea here is that for Hugo, there's like this visual image of any particular concept that he has in mind, like the image of the like when he's thinking of the concept law, he sees the image of the judge in the robes and so on. And I think certain writers have maybe more of a visual bent in that they to evoke a certain emotion or to describe a situation or a certain concept or whatever, they always describe it in visual terms. They might they might have a very vivid mental image that they depict of what the person in the story looks like, or what sort of facial expression they have or whatever. Whereas other writers maybe have less less of a concrete visual depiction of the situation. So Hugo has at least according to Simondon, I'm not that familiar with Hugo, but so this he uses these visual images to convey ideas and emotions in a way that other writers maybe don't do, at least not to the same extent.
Yeah, I remember. I think Ezra Pound distinguishes between poets who are, he calls it phanopoetic, so more image-oriented, or melopoetic, which is more musical and sound-oriented. And then I think there was a third category, logopoetic, which is more like conceptual than either of the other two orientations, but maybe Simondon would say that Hugo is a phanopoetic poet.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, again, you can probably divide these categories in different ways depending on what your sort of particular purpose is. But yeah, I think there are certain writers, like someone like Mallarmé, for example. It's clear that for him, he's much more conceptual. His poems are very abstract and often hard to visualize and so on, compared to other poets that might be more visually. They might describe visual images, and then others who work with the sounds, and the sound is sort of the key element of the poem. Of course, any poem or any decent poem will involve all three elements and some sort of interaction between them. But you can probably make a differentiation between different poets in terms of which side is predominant and which ones are secondary. And this might line up to some extent, at least, with the typology of imaginative types that Simondon is pointing to here. It would be plausible, though maybe not easy to prove, but it would be plausible that poets who themselves have a predominantly visual imagination would use visual images more in their poems, and likewise, for the other senses and types of imagination. So it would be, I don't know how you would go about trying to prove this, especially for poets or authors who have been dead for decades or centuries. But yeah, it's one of the sort of corners of the mind that maybe will never be fully cleared up, but is interesting to think about. Okay, so we can go on to the next page here. If we can get a volunteer to read from the bottom of 113.
I can read. We should note also that the superiority of the quote-unquote visual goes no further than the reversal of a left-to-right sequence into a right-to-left sequence. The visual image is not complete enough to allow reading in all directions, even if the subject enjoys a very developed visual tendency. This is what the experiment of the square of letters, made of 16 or 25 letters placed in a square that must be learned by reading in the usual manner. Binet, Fernald, Muller have found that after learning such a square, a subject has difficulty reciting it from bottom to top, and even more difficulty with diagonal lines. According to Muller, the method used to overcome this difficulty is the same for a quote-unquote visual or quote-unquote oral type. It consists in using groupings and localizations, and all subjects work in the same way. The quote-unquote oral type is described by Binet as corresponding to the translation in names and words of the signs used for a mental operation without graphic support. To add mentally, oral types repeat verbally the names of the numbers. Binet also notes that when learning a text, persons of this type engrave in their mind the sound of the words. There is a considerable set of mnemonic devices using sound images, the list of the names of Roman emperors, the list of pairs of cranial nerves, etc. The structuring of sequences, rhymes, assonances, rhythm facilitates memorization and allows for evocation to be picked up at an articulation point, stanza or verse, without starting the recitation of the text from the beginning. The existence of inseparable blocks repeated in a text, like nouns with their natural qualifier, favors the fixation of sound images. It is found foremost in texts composed when writing was not widespread. This quote-unquote pharmacon, as Plato says, that is, this drug against forgetting, caused the loss of use of memorization devices without material support, among which were all the recurrent aspects of sound sequences so evident in poetry and music. In fact, a spoken text or complex sound sequence, not everything gives rise equally to a mental image. There are privileged structures that even the subject less gifted for oral images retain without alterations, such as Rodrigue a tout du coeur, tout autre que mon père l'éprouverait sur l'heure. That was a quote. This aptitude for becoming image is not directly linked to a theoretical, abstract, or conceptual meaning. The title of Hugo's poem, quote, Oceano Nox, unquote, easily forms an oral image without recourse to its signification, quote, night on the ocean, unquote. In La Parole Intérieure, Egger affirms that any thought is accompanied by a kind of inner noise, which is like a mental speech. Without repeating the example of Mozart cited above, we can cite that of Beethoven, who, having become deaf, rehearsed internally enormous symphonies, or that of Mendelssohn, who was able from childhood to accompany by memory entire operas. In literature, the role of noises and sounds varies according to authors and schools. Daudet has much tenderness towards noises, sounds, and quote-unquote picturesque words that create images. Onomatopoeias abound in his conte, in which we find what the Gestalt school called quote-unquote implicit meanings, integrated in the structure of protagonists and topographical names. Tiste, Veden, Pamperigust, etc. Maybe I'll stop there because the next is a new type. This section seems pretty straightforward. In contrast to the visual type, the oral type remembers in terms of sort of structured groups of sounds as opposed to visual bunchings or groups.
Yeah, and this is something that I think we may have talked about during individuation. I can't remember where it came up, but so Simondon mentions here the sort of structuring of poems as a mnemonic device, and so this is something that was identified by I think, if I remember correctly, it was I forget his name now, but he was working on sort of legends or folk songs in what was then Yugoslavia, and he identified this sort of device of like epithets. So like a certain noun has a certain adjective that goes with it, or a person's name has like a sort of a couple words of description that go with it, and he realized at some point that this sort of matches the structure of epithets in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So you have like swift-footed Achilles. So Achilles is always described or often described as swift-footed. So you have these sort of fixed phrases with a certain metrical structure, and you can sort of use them as bricks to build up a line that has the right metrical structure. And so this sort of process helps to make the poem memorizable, and so like because each component has a certain structure, you can remember where it fits in the line and how each line is constructed and so on. And then of course, there's Plato's famous criticism of writing that it sort of destroys the capacity of memory, which is probably right. In societies where written language is widely used, we tend not to memorize texts in the same way, or poems or songs or whatever, in the same way that non-reading societies do. But yeah, so the idea of this section essentially is that there's this oral type of image that has to be structured in the same way that a visual image has to be structured. Like you can't sort of evoke a visual image, or you don't have a very clear visual image of like a fence with no difference between the different wires that make up the fence. You have to, if you want to have a clear visual image, it has to be of a face or something that has structure to it. And then likewise, in the case of auditory images, it's the structure that allows you to remember, a long sequence of sounds that make up a poem or a musical work. And then one other bit, just as a sort of aside, but right before that bit about the oral image, he talks about the visual images, the task with the square of letters. So you give a subject a sequence of 16 or 24 letters, 25 letters in a square shape, so 4 by 4 or 5 by 5. And then you let them read each line one by one, and then you ask them to sort of remember the visual image of the square. And even subjects who are capable of, say, reading the lines out of from their visual memory, like if you ask them read the third line or whatever. If you ask them, read the third column from bottom to top, or read the main diagonal, these are like extremely difficult tasks that people are essentially incapable of doing. Whereas, of course, if you had the square in front of you, you could, very easily just read the line from bottom to top or read the diagonal. And this reminds me, actually, I recently visited, or a couple months ago now, I visited the British Library when I was in the UK, and I saw a copy of a poem there, a Chinese poem that is written in exactly in this square form, which means that you can read it, and this is also a property of the Chinese language and writing system, but you can read this poem in any direction. So it's actually like, I think, 3,000 different poems that you can read depending on where you start and like what direction you read each line. So all the different combinations of this these characters make up a sequence that makes some sort of sense. So yeah, and this, of course, this is only possible because you have a visual representation. Like you couldn't write a sort of combinatory poem in an oral society that didn't have writing. It wouldn't really make sense, and you wouldn't be able to, read a poem in an arbitrary order without having the visual support to allow for this kind of reading. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting example of this. The difference between a visual support, like a written text, and a visual image or an auditory image that we have in our minds.
This point about oral memory makes me think of the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe, which I think is kind of often unfairly dismissed. But Poe was very conscious of his use of certain consonants like L, M, and N, which he considered more beautiful sounding than like plosive consonants like K and T. Which is why, his poems repeat names like Ulalume, for instance. That's, I don't have anything else to say about that, but I'll post a link in the chat of a good recitation of one of my favorite, Poe, not Pound. I don't know if I've said Pound, but
no, you said Poe. Yeah, I got it.
Oh, good.
That's interesting. And you can also connect this this sort of sound symbolism or sound aesthetics, I guess, with Tolkien's invented languages, the Elvish languages and the other languages. Like he has very clear, like the sort of character of the people that speak the language is supposed to be reflected in the sound of the language itself. So the Elvish languages are supposed to sound beautiful, and the Orcs language is supposed to sound ugly, and so on. So yeah, he had obviously a very clear sort of sound image of like what is depicted by different sounds, or what sort of symbolism different sounds or what emotions different sounds evoke. So yeah, it's also, I think, very hard to study this in a systematic way. Like, there's probably a lot of individual variation in terms of like, what sounds certain people find beautiful and which ones other people find ugly, and so on. But yeah, it would be very interesting to try to like do this in a systematic way and see, like, are there similarities between people in terms of which sounds they find beautiful, and are there differences between speakers of different languages in terms of which sounds they find beautiful, and so on. Yeah, it would be an interesting type of research to do. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. I believe let me just see, the bit about motor types goes on to the next page. So if you can read up to just up to the end, or the first full paragraph on 116. So if someone could read that bit for us. No volunteers again? Okay, I will read this one. Okay. The imaginative, quote, motor type is sometimes associated, according to some researchers, with the, quote, oral type, because there is a link between oral representation and the motions of pronouncing a word or emitting a sound. It should be noted, however, that the span of the register of the human voice is not as broad as that of hearing, even though the maximum of oral sensitivity corresponds to the sounds habitually present in verbal expression and singing. Hence, coupling between phonation and hearing is not total. Stricker has studied in detail the, quote-unquote, motor type in his work titled Du langage et de la musique. Stricker himself claimed to be a typical case. His image words, rather than being visual or oral, were almost all kinesthetic, made of images and perhaps also of sensations and of articulatory motions. Stricker devised a test showing the importance of the motor component of a verbal image by having subjects try to think of words that can be pronounced only with a relatively closed mouth, such as bubble, mutter, wisp, but constrained in advance to keeping their mouth open. Some subjects were unable to imagine these words, which proves that the verbal images are essentially motor. An oral type, to the contrary, can imagine these words while keeping their mouth open. We should add that the motor part in certain images, such as words or numbers, may be substantial for some subjects. In order to recall how a word is spelled, some people need to write it down after having mobilized the concrete register of kinesthetic representations through a few twists of the wrist, without actually writing. A bit like clearing one's voice before singing. Naturally, in such cases, one may speak of a habit. Yet how are we to distinguish exactly a motor habit from a motor image? The real question we should be asking, actually, is that of the legitimacy of a parallel established between the active content of images and the perceptual content. There are, of course, receptions linked to movement and allowing for its adaptation to objects, to the situation, motor and perceptual motor control. Yet perception in no way exhausts the reality of the motion of the body proper. Perceived motion is much more essentially the motion of objects in the perceptual field. In this regard, there may be images of movement in the visual category, others in the sound category, and yet others in the tactile category. It is not solely the sensory organ receiving information that determines on its own a category of mental images, but rather other features related to the situation, stable and simultaneous configuration, irreversible sequences, and recurrences. It would be important to analyze the characteristics of the imagery in a less sensorial and more formalized way, and more logically by treating images as groups of signals. We would then see that the index of movement, stability, duration, alteration, changes in the situation's configuration, affects a large number of images. Michat's study of the perception of causality allows us to discern a few types of images of movement, slithering, shock, pursuit, that appear in perceptual categories and may also be preserved in mental representation. The kinesthetic image of movement is nonetheless clear in the representation of certain objects whose use involves a highly defined gesture, such as a faucet, a nut, a boat, the rotating disc of a telephone, a doorbell button. The vividness of the images of movement linked to these objects shows up in the tendency to act on these objects without a real need, which prods children to touch faucets, phones, doorbells, etc. Right, so this bit is about the third type, the motor type, so the first point here is that there is a certain overlap or blurring of the oral and motor categories, because there seems to be, at least for some people, an association between the sound image of a word and the kinesthetic image of pronouncing that word. So like the experiments where they asked people to think of the word that is pronounced with your mouth in a certain position while your mouth is actually in a different position, and then the subjects report that they can't sort of imagine that word when their mouth is in the wrong position. So the idea would be that these subjects have a sort of kinesthetic auditory image. So when they imagine a word, they're imagining the movements that their mouth has to go through to pronounce that word. And then there's this interesting question of, or maybe before I get to that, so the next bit is the idea that for certain subjects, there's a motor image in the form of the writing of a word. So you have to be able to spell the word, you have to actually write it down. And I think like what I think of here is like if someone asks you to write down, like if someone asks me, for example, to say what order the letters appear in on a keyboard, I would have a hard time with that. Like there's QWERTY, there's that bit, and then after that I would probably get the rest of them wrong. But at the same time, if I'm writing, I can actually write something without looking at the keyboard because I have a kinesthetic sense, like I know where the letters are when I'm actually writing. But if I try to visualize the letters on the keyboard, I can't really do it. So obviously I have a kinesthetic image of the location of the letters on a keyboard that I can access when I actually type, but I can't sort of translate that image into a visual image of the keyboard. And then likewise, so Simondon talks here about people who, if you ask them how to spell a word, they have to sort of go through the motion of writing it. They sort of move their hands. I'm moving my hand now as if you can see me, but obviously you can't. They go through the motion of moving their hand as if they were writing the word, and this sort of helps them to remember the spelling of the word. So for some people, there would be this kinesthetic image would be sort of predominant in a way that it isn't for other people. But I think with these types in general, we should probably keep in mind that, of course, they're not going to be exclusive. It's not the case that some people are exclusively visual and others are exclusively auditory and so on. It would be a sort of difference of predominance or a difference in terms of which situations people use different images in. So some people, when they're trying to remember the spelling of a word, might use this kinesthetic image and sort of move their hand in the pattern of writing the word. Others might picture the like a printed word. They might have like a visual image of the printed word in front of them and use that to remember the spelling. So there would be differences between people in terms of which situations evoke which type of image. This other bit is a bit obscure, I think. The last part of the paragraph, where he suggests that he says it would be important to analyze the characteristics of the imagery in a less sensorial and more formalized way and more logically by treating images as groups of signals. I think what he might be getting at here is the idea that you would want to, like if you were doing a systematic study of images and the image capacity, the capacity to form and manipulate images, what you would want to do is to see, like you would compare the images in different sensory modalities in terms of the structure of the images. So how long does the image last? Like if you show the subject a sequence of letters and they can remember that sequence for say 30 seconds, and then if you read a sequence of letters, can they remember that auditory sequence of letters for 30 seconds as well? Or like, are there differences between these two sensory modalities in terms of how long the image lasts? So I think that's sort of what he has in mind. It would be a sort of more structural comparison between different sensory modalities and different subjects to try to see, like, how long did the images last? How stable are they? What types of errors do people make under certain conditions and so on? It would be a more formal in that sense. It would be less oriented to the specific sensory quality of these images and more related to the structure of like how these images can be used by the subject. And I'm not sure to what extent that has been done, in the years since Simondon wrote this. That would be something, maybe if someone wants to do a research project for us, they could do a little investigation of that. but then maybe the last point that I'll make here is this last sentence that Simondon points to, how certain objects that have a very specific use, like a faucet, on a tap in a sink, like these objects sort of evoke a certain type of use, and the sort of kinesthetic image of turning the faucet is sort of built into our visual perception of that object. We see immediately this object as like something you can turn to get water. And he talks about how, kids have this sort of irresistible urge to like push buttons, and like I think of this like if you go to a museum, they often have these like little exhibits where you push a button to start a video or something, and you see these kids run up and push the button and then run away like without even watching the video. They just have this urge to push the button, and so like, or like you see kids that will get on an elevator and press all the buttons, partly just to annoy people, but like also just because they have this urge to push the button. So they're sort of perceiving the button as like pushable, as something to be pushed, and they have this sort of irresistible urge to perform the action that corresponds to this object. And so I think, this is like an element of perception in any sensory modality. They have these capacities to evoke actions in us. And so that's what Simondon was pointing to here. And these kinesthetic images can be evoked by any sensory modality. Okay, so we're close to time, and we've lost a few people. So I would suggest that we stop here for today, unless anyone else has any sort of final thoughts or questions that they want to bring up. But if not, I think we can stop here for today.
Yeah, I don't really have a fully formed thought on this, but the idea of the kinesthetic image as being sort of prompted by the object, and also the capacity of the perceiver to act on the object. It seems like this is maybe the image is something that individuates out of these. There's like this, I don't know, like maybe not attention in the object itself, but certainly in the like the system of like the button and the kid. There is attention in the sense that the button is capable of being pushed, and the kid wants to push buttons in general. And so the kinesthetic image is kind of individuated out of the tension between those two terms. Does that make sense?
Could you say that again? Sorry, I wasn't distracted by something else.
Just that in the example of the kinesthetic image is maybe it's more obvious in the example of the kinesthetic image that the image is something that is individuated out of this tensed system of the perceiving subject and the object that's perceived. Because in the case of the object that can be turned or pushed or interacted with in some way, and the kid, for example, who generally wants to interact with objects in their environment, there's that these two poles, I guess, constitute a tensed system, and it's as a sort of partial resolution of that tension that the image is individuated.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that makes sense. I guess, I mean, the question that Simondon raises a little bit earlier about like to what extent can we distinguish a motor habit from a motor image, I think is an interesting one in this situation, because like what's distinct, or one thing that's distinct about a motor image is that you can only ever experience it through time. Like you can't, like a visual image you have sort of appear in front of you as something that is sort of there in one moment, whereas a kinesthetic image is something that you can only ever experience by sort of performing the action or imagining the action through time. So I'm not sure exactly what the connection is with your point, but anyway, I think it's what exactly kinesthetic. I think the kinesthetic one is harder to picture as an image or to describe as an image than maybe the visual case is obviously the sort of paradigm case for an image, and then the auditory case is maybe assimilatable to visual image in certain ways, but the kinesthetic one is like, it seems like it feels as if you're sort of stretching the notion of an image more in the kinesthetic case. And maybe that does have to do with this sort of polarization that you are pointing to. Like, the visual image is something that you can sort of have in front of you in a sort of passive, not quite passive way, but like without having any particular action associated with that image. You can just sort of contemplate the visual image, whereas the kinesthetic image is there. You can't have a sort of contemplative relation to it. You have to act or imagine yourself acting to be able to experience the kinesthetic image in the first place. And maybe it's that sort of impulsive nature of the kinesthetic image, the fact that it sort of pushes you to turn the faucet or press the button or whatever. Maybe it's this that makes it harder to describe it as an image. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess I'm just broadly, trying to find continuities between this book and the individuation dissertation, and I guess see the image as something that emerges out of some kind of disparation. It seemed like in the case of the kinesthetic image, it may be easier to picture the image as arising out of a disparation of these two terms, but it's probably operative in the case of all of the images he discusses.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think you're right to see the production of the image as a kind of individuation. He doesn't use that vocabulary, I think, very often in this book, or maybe at all. But and I guess we have to remember that this was like a psychology lecture course, right? So it wasn't people necessarily who had any familiarity with Simondon's system who were attending these classes. So he doesn't really use some of his key terminology about individuation and so on. But yeah, I think it's right to make those connections and try to understand the formation of an image as a kind of individuation, because an image is something individuated, even if its sort of mode of individuation is different than that of like a living being or a crystal or whatever.
Right, that makes sense.
Right, okay. So yeah, let's stop here since we're pretty much at time, and we'll pick up from page 116 next time. So thanks everyone. Thanks to the people who had to leave early that maybe will listen after, and hope to see you all next week.